Hey, Mike.
How you doing?
How's things?
Good, yeah. How have you been?
Grand. I fear that your hair, like my hair, has suddenly got to the stage where it's too long to sort of keep sticking up
Yep.
and is now
Good.
falling down. I notice as well when moving my head, like I can feel the weight. It's quite mad.
I feel like I'm in a L'Oreal commercial or something.
This is very wholesome content to arrive to.
Gordon and I are just practicing our shampoo commercial hairdos. Because we're worth it.
It's true. It's really fun. Who knew that having hair was... Although it does take so much longer to like wash and dry and stuff than just being finished. How's yourselves? Any crack?
Oh, good, thanks. Yeah, so I had a good fun Halloween. That was good. Have you watched it? Have you watched it back? Ian's special was just amazing.
Oh, I haven't. No.
Oh, it's definitely worth watching that 9-minute section. But then the rest of it's good too, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Halloween one, I got it on catch up. It was nice.
Hey.
Hi. Oh, it's so good to see so many faces. I haven't seen any of it.
Yeah. So where have you been, Gordon? What have you been up to?
Well, God, I can't remember. Not much.
Huh?
Yeah.
Haven't seen you for a while. Are you all caught up?
Time is strange. Yes, I caught up just today. I realized I was never going to catch up unless I took bold action. So I downloaded the Kindle book and I read up to 7. So today, so I am fully caught up. It's really, so far it's very exciting, and there's a cast of hundreds which I love, and so many characters that I've already started shipping, which is great.
I've just caught up today as well. Yeah.
I love how many people binge watch Frankie. It just makes me happy.
Yeah, I'm impressed with Gordon downloading the book as a catch-up. I would have just stuck Frankie on like 2 times speed and caught up that way.
Oh my God, I can't imagine listening to that, but it must be something.
So that would be stressful. It would be faster to catch up just by reading, like for sure. That's definitely, if you need to do it.
You'd have to do the first episode though to get Frankie's voices for everyone.
That's true. Also, hi Michael again, who was in the dance class I was literally just in.
There's also, I know we'll
dance
learn.
Class? What's that all about?
I know.
What is it? Hey Frankie.
Hello.
Look at all these people.
I'm looking at them. Hello.
It's been so weird to be away.
Oh my gosh, that's like Christmas.
Bina, are you still at your parents' or are you back home now? Or?
No, this is my house.
I was going to say, because your parents' house looks exactly the same as your house.
No, so I came back today, but also like that's the last time I see that house. So I have like lots of feelings. It's so weird. Like we moved into that house when I was 4.
Wow.
So like I'm really glad that I went down, and it was worth doing 2 weeks of like self-quarantine to be safe to go down. Yeah. But like driving away today was, you know, when you're like, I don't know if I'm crying too much to drive. Like maybe I should stop driving.
Yeah. Oh, sweet.
But it's not even bad. It's just like appropriate emotions for the thing. Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel disproportionate, and I am okay. I'm just a bit like,
yeah. I hope it's okay to say, for what it's worth, you're looking particularly beautiful tonight. Don't
probably the tears.
Doesn't Bina just look particularly fucking gorgeous?
The hair.
It's like super elegant way across your eyes, and you're all glassy eyed, and I'm like,
oh, you always look fabulous, Bina.
Dreamy. You're a dreamboat.
Now,
Oh, we've got a wide awake Carmen as well today.
Oh my God, wide awake, Carmen. That's one of my favourite flavors.
For now.
Who else have we got? Hi, Jonathan. Hi,
Where's
Martin.
Gordon?
I know. Gordon and Kitty.
Oh, they're back.
They're back.
We returned after marathon catch-up sessions.
What do you think of it? What do you think of it so far?
It's very good.
Very good. I'm very excited to hear how all the names are actually pronounced because I caught up on Kindle. I don't know what any of them how they sound, so I'm quite intrigued.
Ooh, can I know how you think they sound though?
Well, I just sort of see it. Do you know that thing where you don't actually sound the name? You just see the letters. I've been doing that a lot. So
It's so hard to do that with the old school Yiddishy names too. I'm always curious as to how people will pronounce them because, like, I know the ones I knew growing up, but there's definitely a bunch that I'm like, I don't know, mean anything.
Also, I love both the Golem and the Djinni is just the best. He's like Mr. Darcy Djinni in that he's just such an arrogant. I love him already. He's very good. And there's so many things.
What's going on with Jen's camera? You're upside down, Jen.
I am upside down. My goodness.
I thought you were doing some sort of magic trick when you walked through that door.
Not that good. So we'll work on it.
Jen, are your bookcases in?
You're in Australia mode.
Yep, they do.
What is this?
Hey!
Hey!
Victory!
Yay! The bookcases are just about in. So, do you want to see?
Yes, always.
There are a few people in after chat lab. I'll show you. So we put some books up to see how it looks. But this is it.
Wow!
Such wonderment in their faces.
Fuck yeah!
We've been trialing out how it's going to look.
Oh, it's for Star Wars.
You've got bisexual lighting, or you had bisexual lighting.
That's its new name. So yeah, we are very pleased, and it's got Neville's. You can't really see it 3D chess set.
Nice.
So, and the obligatory Terry Pratchett bookshelf.
Nice.
That is very satisfying to look at.
That is very cool.
So just a few little wee bits and bobs, and then it's done. So hopefully in the next few days it'll be completely finished.
Will you post a picture when it's done?
Yeah, when it's completely done, I will post up some photos. I'm so pleased. We've been waiting like a year from them. So
Bookshelf porn.
I love how the light kind of shone through whatever that glass thing was that was on there and how it reflected off the metal. It was really lovely.
That is Neville's
Hi, Nev.
Hi.
Hey.
Speaking of Pratchett, would anyone like a copy of The Shepherd's Crown, which is the final book? Because there was a bunch of Pratchett kind of going at my parents' house, and I didn't feel like I could just let it leave. But I have two copies of The Shepherd's Crown. I don't need two copies, so I'm happy to send it to someone.
Me!
Kitty and Nick.
Let's
We're here.
bring it to Paul at some point if we're still allowed to do that next week.
Perfect. Ooh, Nick, I like that top.
It's my pajamas.
It's very nice. It's
Well, thank you.
I like a one of these ones. What do you call that? What do you call that kind of top that has like
I've heard it called a granddad top.
a little buttony collar thing?
A Henley?
A sexy.
Henley, maybe?
Yes, I heard it called a granddad shirt.
Yeah.
Also a granddad shirt.
Big fan. Big fan.
Men need more V-neck type things in their fashion in general.
I like a scoop neck. Big old scoop. How are we doing for time?
We've
The
got
closeness of Katie's face to the camera
Oh, Katie, are
tells
you
me
ready
it might be
for
story
today?
time.
Are those star print jammies?
A big fluffy star.
Oh,
So much.
Okay, well, that's painfully adorable. Setting that aside for a moment until I have the fortitude to deal with that. What? Katie, what time is it? Story time.
I made it just in time.
Hi, Duncan. Okay, everybody. Okay, Malcolm's bathroom. Okay, all of the wonderful new people come across from the catch-up crew. I'm going to make you all be very quiet. You're all going to be very, very quiet. Oh, no, I don't want a search bar. Zoom, why you do this to me? Okay. I think it's all fine. Now, take a little sip of water because we are going to need that for this chapter. Just saying. Hi, Mike. Hi, Bumtooth. Right. Now. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. The man smiled and extended an arm. An invitation to talk? Heart pounding, she fetched a shawl and stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was chill and smelled of rain. She did not close the door behind her, but drew the shawl tightly about herself. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, he said. To apologize? I fear I offended you earlier. You're trespassing on our property and invading my privacy in order to apologize. Yes. I could scream. I could have you arrested. He acknowledged this with silence. They stared at each other across the few feet that separated them. Finally, she relented. All right. I suppose that if you risk so much to apologize, then it is only fair that I offer forgiveness. So, there. You are forgiven. You may go now. He nodded once, bowed to her, and then, in the most graceful movement that Sophia had ever seen, placed one hand on the balustrade and vaulted up onto it. He looked across to the next balcony, and she realized he was readying himself to jump. Wait! She cried. He froze, wobbling slightly, and put out a hand to steady himself. She shuddered to think she might have killed him. I'm sorry, she said. It's only... I just want to know... What is your name? There was a moment when he seemed to consider the question. And then he said, Ahmad. Ahmad, she repeated. Where are you from? You would know it as Syria. I would know it as Syria. What do you know it as? Home, he said. He stood nonchalantly above her on the wide balustrade, not seeming to notice the two-story drop beneath him. Again, she felt that creeping sense of unreality, as though he'd merely stepped from a tale, as though none of this were truly happening. Ahmad, will you tell me something? And for pity's sake, come down from there before you fall. He smiled and jumped back down to the balcony. What shall I tell you? Tell me what it's like where you're from. Where did you live? She'd expected him to name a city, but instead he said, in the desert. The desert? Isn't that dangerous? Only if one isn't careful. The desert is wild, but not impassable. I've seen pictures, she said, in my father's journals, but I'm sure they don't do it justice. Both started at a sudden noise. Someone was knocking at her bedroom door. The man crouched as though about to spring to the balustrade again. Wait, she whispered. Softly, she crept back into the bedroom. She lay down on her bed, mussing the sheets so it would look as though she'd been asleep. "One moment," she called, and then hung her head upside down and shook it vigorously, dishevelling her hair and hopefully bringing a flush to her cheeks. She rose from the bed, adopted an air of listless ill health, and opened the door. A maid stood in the doorway with an armful of linens. She took in the sight of Sophia still in her dressing gown and shawl, and her eyes widened with alarm. "Miss Sophia, your mother says the guests will be here in half an hour." "Maria, I'm afraid that I'm not feeling well," Sophia said. "I have a terrible headache. Will you please tell my mother that I must have a rest first, and then I promise I'll come down to the party?" "What?" cried a voice. Both women flinched as Julia Hamilton Winston, one of the most formidable doyenne of New York society, came charging down the hall in a billowing blue gown, her hair still tied in curling rags. "Mother," Sophia pleaded as the woman advanced on them, "I'm really not feeling well. I'm sorry." "This is nonsense. You were well enough at dinner." "It came on suddenly. My head is pounding." "Then take an aspirin," her mother snapped. "I've certainly suffered through enough parties with headaches and morning sickness and any number of illnesses. You are far too soft, Sophia, and too eager to shirk your responsibilities." "Please," she said, "just a half hour, that's all I'm asking. If I can sleep a little, I'll feel better. And I'm afraid if I stand up much longer, I'll be sick." Her mother placed a hand on Sophia's forehead. "Well, you do feel a bit warm." She took her hand away and sighed, her face still registering distrust. "Half an hour only. Do you understand? And then I'll have Maria drag you from your bed." "Yes, Mother. Thank you." She closed the door and listened as the woman's steps retreated down the hall, then went out once more to the balcony. He was where she had left him, wearing an expression of amusement. "Very skillful," he said. "Do you do that often?" She blushed in the dark. "My mother and I tend to disagree," she said. "We're very different people. We want different things from our lives." "And what is it," he asked, "that you want from your life?" She did not move, but made herself meet his eyes. She would not blush again, she told herself. She would not look away. "Why did you come here? Truly, I mean. None of this nonsense about apologies." "Because you intrigue me, and you are beautiful," he said. She did blush at that, and turned, and placed more distance between them. "You are rather more direct than most men." "And that displeases you?" "No, not as such, but I'm not accustomed to it." She sighed. "To tell the truth, I am very sick indeed of men who are not direct. And tonight this house will be full of them." She glanced over at him again. "Your home in the desert. Will you tell me more?" "One can travel the desert for days, months, years, and never meet another soul," he said quietly. "Or, if you wish, you can seek out the company of the desert peoples, or attempt to trace the ways of those creatures who don't wish to be seen, such as the Djinn. Although that," he said with a secret smile, "is rather more difficult. If somehow you gained the power of flight, you could travel with the birds, the hawks, and the kestrels. Like them, you could sleep as you flew." He paused. "Now I will ask you a question. Why will your house be full of men who aren't direct?" She sighed. "Because I'm coming of age to marry, and because my father is very, very wealthy. They'll all be looking to make an advantageous match. They'll compliment my good looks and my opinions. They'll ask my friends about my tastes and then affect them as their own. I'm about to become the quarry in a hunt, and it isn't even me they want. I'm simply a means to an end." "Are you so certain about that?" If a man tells you that you're beautiful, do you doubt his sincerity? She hesitated, then took a deep breath and said, I suppose it depends on the man. They were drawing closer to each other. The cypress trees that edged the garden were tall enough to screen out much of their surroundings. If she was very still and kept her head at a certain angle, it was as though she was not in New York at all, but in a garden on the Mediterranean coast. The faint noises of the street behind them were the wash of a distant surf. The man beside her was a complete stranger. He could be anyone. She could feel her allotted seconds ticking away. He was waiting, patient and careful, watching her. She shivered. Are you cold? He asked. Aren't you? I'm really cold. He glanced through the French door into the bedroom, but didn't ask whether she would be more comfortable indoors. Instead, he only drew closer to her and slowly, so slowly that she would have had plenty of time to protest, to draw back if this wasn't what she wanted, placed a hand on her waist. At his touch, a blossom of warmth filled the pit of her stomach and spread outward. She could feel the heat of his hand through the layers of her dressing gown and shawl. Her eyes drifted shut. At last she stepped closer and brought her face up to meet his. Later, she would reflect that he did not remark upon her forwardness, or ask her if this was what she truly wanted, or any of the other seemly protests that a man might make to absolve himself of responsibility. At one point, he'd seemed about to pick her up and carry her through the door to her bed, but she'd shaken her head no, not wishing to leave the night in the shadowed garden, terrified that in the too familiar room of her childhood she would lose her nerve. And so their tryst took place in a darkened corner of the balcony, a granite wall cold at her back. She wrapped the ends of her shawl about them both, pulling him close. His hands seemed to be everywhere at once, his lips hot on her skin, raining kisses upon her neck, the hollow of her throat. As her excitement grew, so did the dread of losing this moment, of returning to her life and having to endure the consequences. And so when at last the stars burst behind her eyelids and her entire body turned to fire, it was a fierce sadness as well as joy that made her bury her head in his shoulder and stifle a cry. Finally, she was able to stand on her own feet again. She felt his gentle fingers in her hair, his lips resting at her forehead. She could not look up at him. Tears gathered in her eyes. If she didn't move, if she held perfectly still, she would be able to keep time from tumbling forward. The knock came again at her bedroom door. I must go, she whispered, and broke from him and fled. The next day, the society columns in the city papers proclaimed the Winston soiree a memorable triumph. And indeed, it had been one of those rare evenings in which, through chance combinations of guests and wine and conversation, an honest vivacity takes hold. And it seems that no other house in the city could be as full of lively cheer and good feeling. But the true surprise of the night had been the newly arresting presence of the daughter of the house. Until then, the general opinion of Sophia Winston had been that she was lovely enough, but that she didn't try. Her dreaming, disengaged air, her lack of an inner circle of friends were taken as snobbishness. Among her peers were many girls who came from wealth, but who, for reasons of inheritance or business, were not as secure in their futures as Sophia. And so they resented her for what they saw as an ostentatious disinterest in the game of romantic calculation that they themselves were forced to play. But on this night, in full view of the city's finest, Sophia Winston appeared transformed. She entered late, descending the grand staircase before hundreds of guests. There was a high colour in her cheeks, a marvellous compliment to her close-fitting burgundy gown. And although her air of disinterest hadn't entirely disappeared, it was changed to a much more becoming distraction, as though she were waiting for someone who might appear at any moment. A number of the young men in attendance noticed her truly for the first time, and began to think that it might not be so terrible to marry for money. Sophia's mother saw the new consideration in their eyes, and could not have been more pleased. As for Sophia herself, she spent the evening in a daze of excitement, guilt, and rising disbelief at what she'd allowed to happen. It might all have been a dream, except for the insistent memory of her body. Thinking about it made her feel dizzy and panicked, so she pushed it to the furthest corner of her mind. But in the middle of a conversation it would come rushing back, making her blush and stammer, and then ask the nearest young man if he might fetch her an ice. By the end of the evening she was exhausted. She stood dutifully with her parents as the last guests drifted away into the night, and then retreated upstairs. She didn't expect him to still be there, but she was gripped anew by nervousness as she entered her bedroom. The balcony was dark and empty. The rain that had threatened all day was falling at last in a steady patter upon the garden. Something glinted from the railing. Atop the polished granite sat a miniature golden pigeon, asleep in its filigree cage. The rain transformed the city. It washed the filth from the sidewalks and reflected the glass lamps in puddles of clear water. It drummed on the taut awnings and cascaded from gutters and overhangs into the near-empty streets. Midnight had long since come and gone, and even those with nowhere to go had taken shelter in basement dives and the dark corners of tenement hallways. The Djinni ran alone through the streets of New York. He didn't need to be in danger. At any moment he could simply duck into a doorway and wait for the storm to end. But he wanted, more than anything, to keep running. He resolved that he would run until he reached Washington Street, or until his strength gave out, whichever came first. After Sophia had left him, he'd spent some time standing on her balcony, contemplating the garden below, feeling a peace tenuous enough that he did not care to examine it too closely. Noises from the party drifted upward from the ballroom. On another night, he might be tempted to investigate the opulent mansion while its inhabitants were busy in other rooms. But he sensed he'd tested his luck enough for one evening. On a whim, he withdrew the golden birdcage from his pocket and placed it on the balustrade where Sophia would surely find it. Why not? He had no special attachment to it, and it was a worthy gift, even for the daughter of such a wealthy home. Then, descending the way he'd come, he made his way to the street and turned south. Reaching the elevated, he discovered that it had ceased operation for the night. He would have to walk the entire way back. No matter. He was in a fine mood, and he would not tire from mere walking. Then the rain began. At first it felt slightly invigorating, although different from the frightening prospect of total immersion. But then it started to rain harder, each drop striking him like a tiny blow, and he realized he'd underestimated the distance to Washington Street. He began to walk more quickly, and then to jog. And soon he was running into the rain, a grimace on his face that might have signalled pleasure or pain. The rain struck his bare skin with a faint sizzle. If those few unlucky paupers and policemen still outside had taken the time to look, they would have seen a man running swiftly, silently, with wisps of steam streaming behind him. Faster and faster he ran, cutting west and then south again. He began to feel a slow creeping enervation, a delicious laziness that whispered to him, telling him to simply lie down and let the rain painlessly take him. But he fought down the impulse and ran on, thinking of Arbeely's shop and the ever-warm forge. At last he found Washington Street and raced past the deserted market at Fulton. The rain did not let up. His smooth gait became a stagger, and once he almost fell to his knees, but still he kept on. With the last of his strength, he ran the final blocks to Arbeely's shop. Sam and Lulu's banquet had long since ended. With the plates cleared and the Fadul's coffee house restored to its normal cheerful order, Arbeely had gone back to the forge to work and to distract himself from his concern over the Djinni's disappearance. He felt faintly ridiculous, fretting like a mother hen. As afternoon stretched to evening, his concern became irritation, and then anger, and finally, when the rain began, outright fear. He convinced himself that wherever the Djinni was, he was not so foolish as to be outside in a storm. The door to the shop crashed open. The Djinni tumbled across the threshold and down the short flight of stairs, landing face down on the floor. "My God!" Arbeely ran to his side. The Djinni was unmoving. Curls of steam rose from his clothing. In a panic, Arbeely grabbed him by the shoulders and flipped him over. The Djinni's eyes opened, and he grinned weakly up at his employer. "Hello, Arbeely," he croaked. "I've had the most wonderful evening." Chapter 8. With the arrival of October, the summer weather departed for good. The leaves in Central Park barely had a chance to turn before they fell, to be raked by the gardeners into sodden heaps and carted away. A grey sky filled the gutters with cold, unending drizzle. The busy corner of Allen and Delancey streets, where Radson's bakery stood, was a moving patchwork of greys and browns. Pedestrians in shawls and overcoats trampled piles of garbage, their backs rounded against the wind. Greasy smoke rose from barrels on the edge of the street, where rag pickers and errand boys warmed their hands before moving on. But inside Radson's, the atmosphere was altogether different. The cold wind ended at the door, held back by a constant heat from the two enormous ovens at the rear of the shop. While their customers arrived, stamping their feet and shivering, Mo Radzin worked the ovens in shirt sleeves and an apron, perspiration darkening his broad back. In the middle of the shop stood two large wooden tables perpetually coated with flour, where Thea Radzin and her assistants rolled and braided and kneaded and mixed. The display counter at the front of the bakery stretched nearly the width of the shop and was packed with ryes and wheat loaves and dinner rolls, sweet pastries and macaroons, and honey-sweet strudels stuffed with raisins. General opinion held that Radson's bread was good enough for the price, but that their pastries were the best in the neighbourhood. The bakery lived by its daily rhythm. At 5 o'clock each morning, Mo Radzin unlocked the front door and swept the ashes from the ovens, laid new coals and coaxed them to life. Thea arrived at 5:30, along with their children, Selma and little Abby, who stumbled about half asleep. They uncovered the dough that had been rising overnight, punched it down, and set about shaping the day's first loaves. At 6, the assistants arrived, young Anna Bloomberg and Chava, the new girl. Anna Bloomberg was a source of some consternation to her employers. A tailor's daughter, she had left Cincinnati at 16 and travelled alone to New York. She'd had vague plans of joining the Yiddish theatre and becoming the next Sarah Adler, but the city itself had been the real draw. And after 2 unsuccessful auditions, she'd shrugged, given up, and looked about for a job. The Radzins had taken her on, and she'd become fast friends with the other 2 assistants. It was a major blow for Anna when the young women had left, one so soon after the other. As far as Mo Radzin was concerned, the departures were a mixed blessing. It left him short-handed, but he no longer had to endure the girls' constant gossip and flirtations. So when Radzin's old rabbi had come to see him soon after, along with a tall, solemn-looking greenhorn girl carrying a plate of homemade pastries, he wasn't sure whether to count this new development as blessing or curse. Radzin was not a man given to the benefit of the doubt. He looked from the girl to the rabbi and decided that Maya's story was at least partly a lie. The girl did seem to be in financial straits. Her clothing was cheap and ill-fitting, and she wore no jewellery at all. But the dead husband, he decided, was a fiction, or else beside the point. Most likely this was the rabbi's impoverished mistress. But then, what did it matter? Men had their needs, even holy men. More to the point, if he hired her, the rabbi would owe him a favour. And besides, her pastries were excellent. Soon it became clear that the girl was quite a find. She was a dedicated worker and never seemed to tire. At first they had to remind her to take the occasional break. "We aren't slave drivers, dear," Thea Radzin told her on the first day, after the girl had worked for 6 hours without pause. The girl had smiled, embarrassed, and said, "I'm sorry. It's only that I enjoy the work so much, I don't want to stop." Mrs. Radzin, usually so quick to find fault with her husband's hires, adored her from the start. Thea was a tough-skinned woman with a sentimental core, and the young widow's story played strongly to her sensibilities. One night, Mo Radzin made the mistake of voicing his suspicions regarding the girl's relationship with the rabbi, and in response his wife had blistered his ears with her opinion of his cynicism, his distrust, and from there, his character in general. After that, Radzin kept his theories to himself. But even he had to admire the girl's unflagging energy. At times her hands seemed to move impossibly quickly, shaping rolls and twisting pretzels with uncanny precision, so that each was a mirror image of its neighbours. He'd had plans to fill the other empty position, but within days of the new girl's appearance, the bakery was turning out its usual complement of goods. One less worker meant there was more space to move around, and they were saving nearly $11 a week in salary. Radzin decided that his former assistants had been wasting even more time than he'd thought. Only Anna refused to be won over. She'd been thrown into depression when her confidants had left, and now this new girl seemed to think she was good enough to replace both of them. Of course, the girl's story was wonderfully tragic, but even that dimmed in the face of her awkward silence and ostentatious diligence. Anna watched her work and knew that she herself was now the one who didn't measure up. Anna would have been pleased to know that the Golem wasn't nearly so certain of herself as she appeared. Passing as human was a constant strain. After only a few weeks, she looked back on that first day when she'd worked 6 hours without stopping and wondered how she could have been so careless, so naive. It was all too easy for her to be caught up in the rhythm of the bakery, the thumps of fist on dough and the ringing of the bell over the door. Too easy to match it and let it run away with her. She learned to make a deliberate mistake once in a while and space the pastries a bit more haphazardly. And then there were the customers, who kept their own rhythms and added their own complications. Each morning at 6:30, a small crowd would already be waiting for the bakery to open. Their thoughts pulled at the Golem as she worked. Longings for the beds they had just vacated and the warm arms of sleeping lovers. Dread of the day before them, the boss's orders and the back-breaking labour. And running below it all, the simple anticipation of a nice warm bun or bagel and maybe a sugar cookie for later. At lunchtime came the patrons in search of onion-studded bialys or thick slices of bread. Kerchiefed women with babies in tow would pause at the window outside, wondering what to buy for supper. Errand boys came in clutching hard-earned pennies and left with macaroons and slices of honey cake. Young men and women courted each other slyly in line, casually mentioning a dance that a union group or Landsmannschaft was putting on. If you aren't doing anything, maybe you can stop by. Well, I'm awfully busy tonight, Frankie, but then maybe I will. The golem heard all of it, their words and needs and desires and fears, simple and complex, helpless and easily solved. The impatient customers were the worst, the harried mothers who wanted only a loaf of bread and a quick escape before the children began howling for cookies. A few times the golem even stepped away from her table toward these women, drawn to fetch whatever they wanted so they would leave. And then she'd catch herself and stretch her fingers out and draw them in again, in the way that another woman might take a deep breath and remind herself to be more careful. Anna and Mrs. Radzin took turns seeing to the customers. Mrs. Radzin in particular was a model of efficiency at the counter, chatting quickly with them. Hello, Mrs. Lieb, is it Halla for you today? And your mother, is she better? Oh, the poor dear. Do you want with poppy seeds or without? She filled orders almost without looking, monitoring the glass case as its contents dwindled and anticipating what would need resupplying in the afternoon. After 10 years at the bakery, the woman had a near-perfect sense of what would be popular on a given day and what wouldn't. Anna, on the other hand, could barely remember what was on offer, let alone which items were running low. Her talents lay in a completely different direction. She discovered that standing behind a counter was, in its own way, as satisfying as being on stage. She had a smile for everyone and complimented the women and admired the men and made funny faces at the children. The golem noticed how the customers' moods improved when Anna was at the till and felt her own burst of envy. How did the girl do it? Was it a learned skill or did it come to her naturally? She tried to imagine herself chatting and laughing with a room full of strangers, completely at her ease. It seemed an impossible fantasy, like a child wishing for wings. Thea Radzin had decreed that before the golem could work at the counter, she must learn the baking itself, and so for the first few weeks she was spared a turn at the register. But inevitably the afternoon came when Mrs. Radzin was out on an unexpected errand, and Anna had to visit the water closet. And Mr. Radzin turned from the oven, gesturing at her with his chin. Go on. She approached the register gingerly. She knew, in theory, what to do. The prices were all clearly posted, and there was no question of whether she could handle the numbers. She discovered she could tell at a glance how many cookies were on a baking sheet, or the value of a random handful of coins. It was the talking that frightened her. She imagined making some terrible, unforgivable mistake and running away to hide under the rabbi's bed. At the front of the line was a stout woman in a knitted shawl who stood scanning the rows of loaves. Over a dozen people were clustered behind her, their faces all turned towards the golem. For a moment she quailed, but then, with an effort, she pulled her attention away to focus on the woman in the shawl. Immediately, she knew the order as if the woman had said it out loud. A rye bread and a slice of strudel. What would you like? She asked the woman, feeling faintly ridiculous since the answer was so plain. A loaf of rye, the woman said. The golem hesitated, waiting for the second half of the order. But the woman said nothing. And perhaps some strudel? She asked finally. The woman laughed. You caught me looking, did you? No, I have to watch my figure. I'm not the slip of a thing I used to be. A few of the others' customers were smiling now. Embarrassed, the golem fetched the rye. Apparently she could assume nothing, even a desire as simple as a bakery order. She gave the woman the rye and made change for her nickel. The woman said, You're new here, aren't you? I've seen you working in the back. What's your name? Hava, said the golem. Green as grass, aren't you? Don't worry, you'll be an American soon enough. Don't work this one too hard, Mo, she called to Mr. Radzin. She doesn't look it, but she's delicate. I can tell these things. Radzin snorted. Delicate my foot. She can braid a dozen challahs in 5 minutes. Really? The woman's eyebrows raised. Then you'd better treat her well, hadn't you? He snorted again, but made no other reply. The woman smiled kindly. Take care, Havala. And she left, carrying her rye. A heavy satchel slung across his back, Rabbi Meir walked slowly up Hester Street towards his home, ignoring the dirty puddles that threatened to drown his shoes. It was late afternoon, and the cold and damp had taken on a wintry edge. He'd developed a cough when the weather turned, and now it nagged at him as he climbed his staircase. More troubling, he'd begun to experience strange moments of vertigo, when it seemed as though the ground had disappeared beneath him and he was spinning through the air. It would last only a few seconds, but it left him trembling and exhausted. His strength was ebbing away exactly when he needed it most. His rooms were empty and chill, the sink stacked with dishes. Now that the Golem was living at a boarding house a few blocks away, all had returned to its former neglect. How quickly he'd grown used to a woman's presence. He felt oddly bereft now, going to bed each night without seeing her at her solitary post on the couch, gazing out the window at the passers-by. And yet, time and again he wondered if he'd made a terrible error in judgment. Lately, he'd spent nights lying awake and imagining what might happen if through his carelessness the Golem harmed someone or was discovered. He pictured a mob descending on the Lower East Side and turning Jewish families out onto the street, looting synagogues and pulling old men about by their beards. It would be the very sort of pogrom they thought they'd left behind. In these moments, submerged in his terrible thoughts, he was tempted to go to her boarding house and destroy her. It would be easy to do. A single phrase spoken aloud. Few still had the knowledge, and it was only by sheerest chance that he'd learned it. His yeshiva had been home to an ancient Kabbalist, half mad and steeped in lore. The old man had taken a liking to 16-year-old Avram and adopted him as a sort of secret pupil, showing him mysteries that the other rabbis would occasionally hint at but dared not touch. Young Avram had been too excited by his special status to consider whether the knowledge might come to be a burden instead of a gift. In one of his final lessons, the old man gave Avram a lump of brownish-red clay and bade him construct a golem. Avram shaped the clay into an approximation of a man 6 inches tall, with sausage-shaped arms and legs, and a round, dull head with pinprick eyes and a shallow slash for a mouth. The old rabbi gave Avram a scrap of paper on which was written a brief phrase. Avram said the words, his heart pounding. Instantly, the dark little thing sat up, looked around, and then stood and began to walk briskly about the tabletop. Its limbs bent oddly without benefit of joints. Avram had made one leg too long, and the little golem moved with a lurching swagger like a sailor newly ashore. It gave off a not unpleasant whiff of freshly turned earth. Command it, the old rabbi said. Golem, said Avram, and the doll-like thing pulled instantly to attention. Jump up and down 3 times, Avram said. The golem executed 3 small hops, reaching about an inch off the table. Avram grinned with excitement. Touch your head with your left hand, he said, and the golem did so, a toy soldier saluting its commander. Avram cast about for something else for the golem to do. In a corner near the desk, a brown spider sat lazily spinning a web between 2 discarded bottles. Kill that spider, he said, pointing. The golem leapt off the desk and fell to the floor. It picked itself up and scampered to the corner. Avram followed it, holding a candle aloft. The spider, sensing the golem's approach, tried to scramble away, but the golem was on top of it in a dark blur, scattering the bottles and smashing the spider with its crude fist. Avram watched his creation attack the spider again and again until it was little more than a damp mark on the yeshiva floor. And still the golem went on attacking. "Golem, stop," Avram said in a thin voice. The golem glanced up briefly, but then resumed smearing the spider's remains into the ground. "Stop," he repeated in a louder voice, but now the golem didn't even look at him. Avram felt a rising panic. Silently, the old rabbi passed him another slip of paper with another phrase. Gratefully, he took it and read it aloud. The little golem burst apart in mid-swing. A small shower of dirt rained down among the bottles and the dead spider. Then, blessed silence. "Once a golem develops a taste for destruction," the old rabbi said, "little can stop it save the words that destroy it. Not all golems are as crude or stupid as this one, but they all share the same essential nature. They are tools of man, and they are dangerous. Once they have disposed of their enemies, they will turn on their masters. They are creatures of last resort. Remember that." He'd thought about his crude golem for a long time afterward, haunted by the image of the small creature and its frenzy of violence. Had he done wrong to animate it in the first place? How much did a spider's life count for in the eyes of God? He trod on spiders all his life. Why did this death feel so different? He had atoned for both golem and spider at Yom Kippur that year, and for years afterwards. Gradually, his everyday slights towards kin and colleagues had crowded the incident from his prayers, but he'd never been able to dismiss it entirely. In that room, he had commanded life and death, and later he'd wondered why the Almighty had allowed him to do so. But the purpose of the lesson became clear on the day when the rabbi spied, walking through Orchard Street's riotous crowd, a tall woman in a wool coat and a dirty dress, who carried in her wake the scent of freshly turned earth. No matter how much he was tempted, he knew that he couldn't destroy her. She was an innocent and not to blame for her own existence. He still believed this, no matter how much his fear tried to convince him otherwise. It was the real reason why he had named her Chava, from Chai, meaning life, to remind himself. No, he could not destroy her. But perhaps there was another way. He sat at the parlour table, opened the leather satchel and withdrew a stack of books and loose papers. The books were old and time-eaten, their spines and bindings cracking. The loose papers were covered with notes in the rabbi's own hand, copied from those books that had been too fragile to move. He'd spent weeks of mornings now, walking from synagogue to synagogue, making excuses to drop in on old friends, fellow rabbis he hadn't seen in years. He took tea, inquired after their families, listened to stories of fading health and congregational scandals. And then he asked for a small favour. Would he be able to spend a few minutes in his friend's private library? No, there was no particular book he was looking for, just a question of interpretation, a particularly thorny issue that he meant to solve for a former congregant, a matter of some delicacy. It raised their suspicions, of course. As rabbis, they'd all seen every sort of conundrum that a congregation could throw at them, and there were few problems that couldn't be discussed in confidence, as a hypothetical, if nothing else. Rabbi Meir's request suggested something else, something disturbing. But they acquiesced and left their offices to give their friend some time alone. And when they returned, he was gone. A note left folded on the desk or chair would inform that he'd remembered an appointment and must apologise for leaving so suddenly. Also, he'd found an interesting book that shed some light on his situation and had been so bold as to borrow it. He would return it, the note assured them, within a few weeks. And when the rabbis searched their bookcases for the missing book, invariably, and to little surprise, they found that he'd taken the most dangerous volume they owned, the one they'd always meant to destroy but never quite could. Often the book had been hidden, but the rabbi had managed to find it anyway. It made them all deeply uneasy. What could Maya possibly want with that knowledge? But they said nothing to a man. There was desperation in Maya's evasions and near thefts, and they began to feel a guilty relief that he hadn't brought them into his confidence. If the book could help, so be it. They could only pray that whatever problem Maya was facing would be taken care of as soon as possible. The rabbi put water on to boil for his tea and prepared a meagre supper. Challah and schmaltz, a bit of herring, a few half-sour pickles, a drop of schnapps for later. He was not particularly hungry, but he would need the strength. He ate slowly, clearing his mind, preparing himself. And then he set the dishes aside, opened the first book, and began to work. At 6 o'clock, Thea Radzin turned the sign in the bakery window from open to closed. The dough for the next morning's loaves was set out to rise, the tables wiped down, the floor swept clean. The leftover goods were put aside to be sold at cut rate the next day. At last, the Radzins, Anna and the Golem all filed out the back door and went their separate ways. The Golem's boarding house was a creaking clapboard building that had somehow evaded demolition. It sat incongruously among Broome Street's modern tenements, an old lady sandwiched between hulking toughs. The Golem opened the front door quietly, went past the damp and faded parlour and headed upstairs. Her room was on the second floor, facing the street. It was no larger than the rabbi's parlour, but it was her own, a fact that made her excited, proud, and lonely all at once. There was a narrow bed, a small writing desk, a cane-bottomed chair, and a tiny armoire. She would have preferred to do without the bed, since she had no need of it, but a room without a bed would certainly raise questions. For the room, she paid $7 per week. To any other working girl with her salary, this would have been near impossible. But the Golem had no other expenses. She bought no food and never went out except to the bakery and to visit the rabbi once a week. Her only other expenditure had been to fill out her wardrobe. She now owned a few changes of shirtwaist and skirt, along with a dress of plain grey wool. She'd also bought a full complement of ladies' undergarments, and when the weather turned cold, a woolen cloak. For these expenses, as well as the burden of washing them that fell to her landlady, she felt obscurely guilty. She had no real need for any of it. The cloak especially was for show. She felt the October cold and damp, but it didn't bother her. It was merely another sensation. The cloak, on the other hand, scratched at her neck and trapped her arms. She would have been happier to walk down the street in only her shirtwaist and skirt. All of the boarding house tenants received a small breakfast each morning, left outside their door. A cup of tea, 2 slices of toast, and a boiled egg. The tea she poured into the water closet sink when no one else was around. The toast and boiled egg she wrapped in a piece of waxed paper and gave to the first hungry child she passed on her way to the bakery. She didn't have to do this. She had discovered that she could, in fact, eat. On one of her last nights at the rabbi's, curiosity and boredom had overcome her lingering trepidation, and she decided to ingest a small piece of bread. She'd sat at the table staring at it, building courage, and then carefully placed it in her mouth. It sat on her tongue, strangely heavy, Moisture welled up around it. It tasted like it smelled, only more so. She opened and closed her mouth, and the bread grew damp and broke into smaller pieces. It seemed to be working, but how could she be sure? She chewed until there was nothing left but a paste, then gathered it all to the back of her mouth and worked her throat to swallow. The bread slid down her throat, encountering no resistance. She stayed at the table for hours, slightly nervous with the anticipation of something. But to her slight disappointment, the night passed without incident. The next afternoon, however, she felt a strange cramp in her lower abdomen. Hesitant to leave, the halls were crowded with neighbours and the rabbi was out on an errand. She fetched a large bowl from the kitchen, then bunched up her skirts, pulled down her underclothes, and expelled into the bowl a small amount of mashed bread, seemingly unaltered by its journey. When the golem later excitedly described to the rabbi what had happened, he turned a bit red and congratulated her on her discovery, and then asked her not to do it again. The act of eating proved useful at the bakery, as she learned to make adjustments based on taste, and to eat a pastry occasionally as the others did. But it was hard not to feel each prop, the cloak and the toast and the quickly eaten pastries, as a small pang, a constant reminder of her otherness. It was early evening still. An entire night stretched before her. She opened her armoire and removed her grey dress. From beneath her bed, she withdrew her small sewing box and scissors. Settling herself in the cane chair, she began to pick apart the dress at the seams. Within minutes, it had become a small heap of fabrics. The buttons she laid carefully on the desk to save for last. She had devised this occupation soon after coming to the boarding house, when she'd spent an evening so dull that she'd resorted to counting things to pass the time. She'd counted the tassels on her lampshade, 18, and the number of boards in the floor, 247, and had opened the armoire in search of more things to count when her gaze fell on the dress. She removed it from the armoire and studied how it was made. It seemed simple enough. The large panels that connected at the seams, the darts that shaped the bosom. Her sharp eyes took in each element, and then she set to work, uncreating and then creating it again. It was a pleasant occupation, sewing. She reconstructed the dress slowly, making it last, her stitches as short and even as a machine's. When she finished, it was almost 4 in the morning. She stripped her underclothes and slipped the dress over her head, buttoning it with quick fingers. She smoothed down the front of the dress and eyed her reflection in the window. It was not an entirely flattering dress. It hung loosely from her shoulders as though made for a larger woman, but it had cost little and seemed to cover her appropriately. She took it off and hung it back in the armoire and put on a fresh shirtwaist and skirt. Then she blew out the lamp, lay down on the bed, closed her eyes, and waited for the day to begin. Chapter 9. A couple of pages. It took the Djinni nearly a week to recover from his run through the rain. He spent the time working in the shop as though nothing had happened, but he was paler than usual and moved more slowly and stayed close to the heat of the forge. He declared that his adventure had been worth the ordeal. Arbeely, however, was furious. "You could have been caught," yelled the tinsmith. "The girl's servants could have found you, or worse, her family. What if they trapped you there and called the police?" "I would have escaped," the Djinni said. "Yes, I suppose you'd think little of handcuffs or a prison cell. But think of me, if not yourself. What if the police had chased you here, to my shop? I would have been dragged to prison as well, and I can't melt through iron bars, my friend." The Djinni frowned. "Why would you be arrested?" "Don't you understand? The police would round up everyone in Little Syria if the Winstons demanded it." He covered his face with his hands. "My God, Sophia Winston! You'll bring a whole city down upon us. A thought occurred to him. You aren't thinking of going back, are you? The Djinni smiled. Perhaps. I haven't decided. Arbili only groaned. But there was no denying that the Djinni's mood was vastly improved. He began to work more quickly and with enthusiasm. The encounter, and perhaps the danger, had returned something of him to himself. Soon the shelves of the back room were cleared of dented pitchers and scorched pots. With his new apprentice handling the repair work, Arbili was free to take on larger orders for new cookware. The weather turned colder, the nights longer, and one day, while entering October's orders and expenses on his ledger, Arbili realised, to his great shock, that he was no longer poor. Here, he said, giving the Djinni a number of bills. This belongs to you. The Djinni stared at the handful of paper. But this goes beyond our agreement. Take it. This is your success as well as mine. What should I do with it? The Djinni asked, nonplussed. It's long past time you found yourself somewhere to stay. Nothing too ostentatious. No glass palaces, if you please. The Djinnis followed Arbili's advice and took a room in a nearby tenement. It was larger than Arbili's, though not by much, and on the top floor, so that at least he could see over the rooftops. He outfitted the room with a number of large cushions, which he scattered about the floor. On the walls, he hung a profusion of small mirrors and candle sconces, so that at night the candlelight would reflect from wall to wall and make the room seem larger than it was. But he could not quite trick himself. Even if his eyes were deceived, he felt the closeness of the room like an itch on his skin. He took to spending more of his nights out on the street, exploring. When the streets felt too confining, he would travel the rooftops, which were like a city unto themselves, populated with groups of men who huddled together around fire barrels, sharing cigarettes and whiskey. He tended to avoid conversation, only nodding at their greetings. But one evening, curiosity overcame his reserve, and he asked an Irish labourer if he could try his cigarette. The man shrugged and handed it over. The Djinni placed the cigarette in his mouth and drew in a gust of air. The cigarette disappeared into ash. The men around them goggled, then burst out laughing. The Irishman rolled another and asked the Djinni to show how he had accomplished the trick, but the Djinni only shrugged and then inhaled more gently, and the new cigarette burned as theirs did. All agreed that the first cigarette must have been faulty somehow. After that, the Djinni was rarely without tobacco and rolling papers. He appreciated the taste of the tobacco and the warmth of the smoke in his body. But to the puzzlement of all who stopped him on the street to ask, he never carried matches. One night he returned to the park at Castle Garden, where he had stood at the railing with Arbili that first afternoon, and discovered the aquarium. It was an otherworldly place, both fascinating and unnerving. After melting the front door padlock off its hasp, he stood for hours in front of the gigantic water tanks, staring at the long, dark shapes that glided inside. He'd never seen fish before, and he wandered from tank to tank, enthralled by their variety. This one large and grey and sleek-finned, that one flat as a coin and gaily striped. He studied the rippling gills and tried to guess at their purpose. He placed his hands on the smooth glass of the tank and felt the weight of the water behind it. If he heated the glass enough to shatter it, the water would kill him in an instant. And a thrill coursed through him, the same a man might feel if he stood on the edge of a high cliff and half dared himself to jump. He returned again and again, nearly every night for a week, until the staff posted a guard. Their strange burglar never seemed to steal anything, but they'd grown sick of replacing the locks. He was becoming a familiar figure among the nocturnal population of southern Manhattan. A tall, handsome man who wore no hat or overcoat, and who surveyed his surroundings with a detached, bemused air, like a visiting dignitary. The policemen found him particularly puzzling. In their experience, a man roaming the streets at night was generally looking for a drink, a fight, or a woman, but he seemed interested in none of these. They might have thought him an uptown gent slumming in costume, which happens sometimes. But when he spoke to them, which was rare, it was in an accented English far from that of the New York swell. Someone suggested he might be a high-class gigolo, but then why would he be trawling the streets like a two-penny whore? Finally, their speculations exhausted, they categorized him as a miscellaneous oddity. One of them took to calling him the Sultan, and the nickname stuck. On rainy nights, the Djinni stayed in his tenement room and occupied himself by practicing his metalwork. He was now making regular trips to the Bowery storefront where he purchased gold and silver and fashioned them into small birds of every kind. He made a kestrel with its wings outspread, building the sculpture from the base upward to distribute the weight evenly. He sculpted a silver peacock and decorated its tail feathers with melted gold, painting it onto the cool silver with a straw from Arbeely's broom. Soon he had amassed a half dozen of these sculptures, all in various stages of completion. The month lengthened, and it began to rain nearly every night. Sick of his sculptures, the Djinni took to working all night in the forge, or else merely pacing his room, waiting for sunlight. What, he wondered, was the point of emerging from the flask if he was only to be caged again? Finally, on a night in early November, the rain ended and the sky cleared, revealing a few weary stars hanging above the gas lamps. The Djinni walked through the streets with swift relief. He travelled north and east, choosing his turns at random, enjoying the cold air on his face. The restlessness of his pent-up nights had turned him lonely. And now, without quite consciously willing it, he found himself heading for the Winston mansion.
Yay!
Hey Rabbi, let me tell you about this one dump I took.
Look! You're not looking!
I could see, so on my gallery view, I had Mike, Gordon, and Kitty and Rory, and like trying not to burst out laughing as I saw all of your faces. That bit was a real struggle. So good. So good.
Some things are just worth talking about.
That first chapter was real horny.
Did you all enjoy the sexy bits?
I like starting on a sexy bit, just like dove us right in.
We need to brain afterwards.
Yeah, no prep here.
Gordon, do you have any notes?
I didn't make any, but I have so many notes. It's crazy.
Because I'm just wondering about that section talking about the rabbi's anxieties around a golem being a destructive force and all that kind of thing. And then the next scene was her idly dismantling a dress out of curiosity, but then putting it back together again. And I feel like there was a deliberate juxtaposition. I don't know.
Really enjoyed that.
Scary.
Themes of creation and destruction, all running wild. I like it.
More.
More. More.
Does anyone else remember the scene in the sex scene in American Gods with the djinn who's a taxi driver?
Yes. Yes. I mean, maybe.
Sure.
I do not grant wishes.
Hey,
God,
Rory, do you
say
want to
that
read
to
that at Saucy Time, Rory?
Oh shit! Yeah, I would love to. Absolutely.
Can you actually though?
Yeah, no, totally.
Okay, done. Right, it's recorded. We've got you on record.
As an aside, it was very nice being the catch-up crew and hearing you guys say goodbye, catch-up crew. We love you. It's really just like lovely. I'm like, they're talking to me.
You. It's you. This whole time, it's been you.
And future you too, when you decide, oh man, I forgot that part of that book that was really beautiful. I'm gonna go back and then accidentally just keep listening and then listen to your friends talk, and then they're like, oh man, I'm the catch-up crew this time.
Maybe the real catch-up crew was the friends we made along the way.
Oh my God. That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. On that note, should we say goodbye to the catch-up crew? Let's do it. Catch-up crew, I hope you enjoyed it. We love you. Goodbye.
Bye.